Welcome to another flipped video lesson with Mr. Volkman. Today we'll be talking about the Fifth Amendment and all about the legal rights that come with it. This flipped video is going to be based on lesson 10.5a in our textbook. As always with our Bill of Rights flip videos, we're going to read from the Fifth Amendment itself. Now, beware, there's a lot in this amendment. Don't get lost in the wordiness of it, because we will go through each section step by step. Follow along, please, as I read. No person shall be held to answer for a capital or otherwise infamous crime, unless on a presentment or indictment of a grand jury, except in cases arising in the land or naval forces or in the militia, when in actual service in time of war or public danger. Nor shall any person be subject for the same offense to be twice put in jeopardy of life or limb, nor shall be compelled in any criminal case to be a witness against himself, nor be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. Nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation. So based on what I just read with the Fifth Amendment, there are 5 different rights in this Fifth Amendment, and they are as follows. That you have a right for a grand jury hearing, you cannot be put in double jeopardy, you cannot have self-incrimination, you must have due process in a court of law, and there's also this issue of private property versus government usage. Now, throughout this flip video, the pictures I have are comics that have to do with what I'm talking about. Please make sure you pause the video to read through the comics, because in a lot of ways they have a lot to do in a very humorous way with what I'll be teaching about. As always, this video is for educational purposes, so please pause the video if you do not understand something, or if you need to write extra notes in your outline. The first right that's covered in the Fifth Amendment that I'll be talking about has to do with the grand jury. Now, the grand jury hearing was used for people that were accused of serious crimes. It was a way to have the government's evidence heard by a jury of citizens. Now, only federal court cases do this, or at least required to do it anyways. However, half of the 50 states in our country have state grand juries. Now, you may be wondering, what's the point of having grand jury hearings? Well, they were originally thought of as a sword, wha-cha, 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 and a shield, ching, a sword and a shield. It was thought of as a sword to accuse individuals of a crime. And it was thought of as a shield to protect citizens against harsh or illogical and unrestrained authority. And when I say unrestrained, I mean like harsh. So it was a shield to protect people who really maybe weren't guilty. And it was a way for a sword to make sure people who are guilty got the punishment they deserved. Nowadays, though, grand jury hearings are used more for prosecutors, the lawyers who are going against the bad guys, to see which pieces of evidence witnesses seem the most convincing. Now, the important thing to remember in a grand jury hearing, the prosecution does not have to show all the evidence. And it is only the prosecution that shows evidence. The defendant does not show any. The grand jury hearing doesn't say whether you're guilty or not. It's just a way to get the evidence out there. Let's talk now about double jeopardy, which is the second right in the Fifth Amendment. This just means that the government cannot put an individual to trial repeatedly for the same crime if that person's not found guilty. Now, there is one exception to this rule. If first off you have a hung jury, which means the jury can't decide if the person's guilty or not. Usually this ends up happening if half the jury thinks they're guilty and half the jury thinks they're not guilty. Or double jeopardy can occur if there is a mistrial, meaning the trial was stopped before the verdict was given. Other than that, you can't have double jeopardy and try someone more than once for the same crime if they're found not guilty. shows, you may have heard the actors or actresses say, "I'm taking the fifth." Well, that just means that people cannot be forced to answer questions that could make them seem guilty if they're in court. You have that right that if you're in court and the lawyer asks you, "Did you see this person 2 minutes before they died?" and you actually did see them, you don't have to answer that question because that means you could be found guilty. Now, this also applies to witnesses to a crime as well, if it could incriminate them in a crime. They don't have to answer those questions. They can plead the fifth. The rights I just talked about only apply in the courthouse if you're on trial. However, you have rights when it comes to police and lawyers outside of a courthouse as well. And these are called your Miranda rights. And these take place if you're arrested. Police officers, or if someone arrests you, has to do the following 3 things. First off, they have to warn you to be quiet. They have to warn you that statements you do say can be used against you in the courtroom. And finally, they can let you know that you can have a lawyer when you're being questioned by the police. Now, even though you have these rights, a suspect can still waive them. Now, if a police officer does not do these 3 things, any evidence they collect is not and cannot be used in a court of law. So it's extremely important that police officers do the Miranda rights because all their hard work could be for nothing if they find something important but they didn't give someone these rights. That's covered in the Fifth Amendment has to do with due process. Now, part of a due process is this, that a person cannot have their life, liberty, or property taken without this due process. So, what is due process? I've said the word quite a bit right now. Part of due process is that everyone has a right to fair court proceedings. For example, a judge should not be biased toward the accused, either for them or against them. And if you take a look at this comic, this is a pretty good example of a judge who's pretty biased against this person. Next, the accused has a right to have lawful court proceedings, meaning the court can't withhold evidence showing that the person could be innocent. That's really important. Lastly, the person needs to have the opportunity to be heard. Now, they may not want to, but they need to have that right. Lastly, due process is all about following the laws and rules that are already made for court proceedings. And if we look at this comment here, part of that is that if you have a jury, they need to be impartial. They can't already have preconceived thoughts about the accused person, whether they're guilty or they're innocent. That's right. In the Fifth Amendment, it's all about the government versus private property, or as I titled it, government takings. You see, the government cannot take private property for public use without compensation. When I say compensation, I mean the government has to give the owner of the private property fair value for it, whether it's in cash or they give them more than what the property's worth. This was created to ensure that the government cannot force certain people or certain groups to help the country. Now you may think, well, if the government's taken something, it's for a good reason, right? Well, yes and no. You see, if the government's going to take private property from an individual for public use, everyone should have the opportunity to have the government help people. You can't just have the government picking on certain groups and certain people all the time, whether it's land for a playground or park or a school or for a road. Now, the government can do this. However, when they do it, property needs to be given to another group or another person. Also, the taken property should be used for public benefit, not for private gain. Thank you for watching this flip video. Other questions will be on Edmodo. Thank you.